Good morning. I'm Maurice Crespi, Managing Partner of Schindler's Attorneys. I'm joined by my panelists, Emma, Peter Gordon, Gary Baruchovitz, and Tisha. What we'll be doing today is we'll be discussing business rescue in general, and then we'll be dealing with specific issues, what we call take-homes, which are quite important for you guys to make notes of. So we'll give you guys a general overview of business rescue, but we ask that you be mindful of the fact that COBRA is not about business rescue. COBRA is about avoiding business rescue. The idea is that companies come into the COBRA ecosystem, and COBRA assists in mediating arrangements between debtors and creditors, so between your company, your business, and your creditors. And then in turn, we invite those creditors to come into the ecosystem so that we can negotiate arrangements all the way up the supply chain to strike balances in relation to the various businesses in the supply chain's cash flow. So what you're hearing today is business rescue, but as a last resort. Business rescue, you'll hear from Peter shortly, gives you a moratorium. The moratorium is on any claims against your business. So if you owe money, a moratorium kicks in on business rescue. But in the present climate, creditors are generally being more reasonable because they understand that it's an act of God. They understand that this isn't poor decision making, and they understand that they are also subject to the same external pressures that you are. So it makes sense to only go into business rescue if there's an unreasonable creditor out there. So COBRA and the team engaged IQ Business and all the partners, dozens of partners, are there to keep you out of business rescue, and the rescue process is merely designed to give you breathing space in the event of an unreasonable creditor. There are other instances that we'll go through where business rescue remains appropriate, even in the context of friendly creditors being prepared to negotiate. So I'll kick off with Peter. Peter, can you give us just a broad outline of business rescue? Peter, thanks.
Maurice, sure. Thank you for that, and welcome everybody. Business rescue, it's regulated by Chapter 6 of the Companies Act. As Maurice has already said, the main purpose, it provides a absolute moratorium to protect the company from any legal action. We refer to a steel blanket around the company, and that allows the company the breathing space to sort out its affairs. The company can go into business rescue in one of two ways. Either the directors take a resolution. It's a very simple process. You need 50% plus one of the directors to agree to the business rescue. And what the directors need to look out for, and here's, as Maurice talked about take-homes, here's an important point. Keep monitoring the financial stability of the company. And if the company at any time, the directors that is, believes that the company will not be able to settle its liabilities as and when they fall due in the next 6 months, then the company should be considering rescue because it's classed as financially distressed. Or if in the next 6 months the directors believe that the liabilities of the company, fairly valued, will exceed the assets of the company, fairly valued. So if either of those two are present, I would suggest that most companies, certainly most SMEs in South Africa at the moment, fall into one of these categories because of COVID, and therefore the directors should be considering what their actions are. If the directors decide not to go into rescue, they should then really put up a reason and take professional advice as why they're not going into rescue. And Marie's covered that, and COBRA is one of the places that you come in for that protection. And when we're talking about protection here, this protection of the directors, because Chapter 22 of the Companies Act, directors can be held personally liable for reckless trading if the company were ever, heaven forbid, to land up in liquidation. So now the directors have taken the resolution and they decided that business rescue is the right approach. They then take a copy of their resolution. They also need to do a sworn affidavit, and in that affidavit, importantly, the directors have to state a little bit why the company's in rescue, but the most important thing in there is that the directors believe that this company can be rescued, so that they do see an opportunity, given a period, let's say 6 months or whatever, that the company should be able to trade out of its current financial difficulties. They are then obligated within 3 days to appoint a business rescue practitioner or practitioners. You can do joint appointments. And the practitioner then essentially takes over in a supervisory role the company, the management of the company. The practitioner comes in with full fiduciary responsibilities in terms of Section 75, 6 and 7 of the Companies Act, and has to perform in the best interests of the company. The alternative to a director's resolution is any affected party, broadly the shareholders, creditors, staff, anybody that's owed money by the company, can apply to court for the to place the company into business rescue. More difficult because it's an external party and they're having to prove to the court that the company is financially distressed. But, you know, court applications often do arise. SA Express was one that went into business rescue on a court application recently. Once it's in rescue, the practitioner, as I said, is in complete control of the business. He can do anything with the assets of the business. He can borrow against them. He can sell them. He can utilize them in the production of income. He can go through a Section 189 in terms of the Labor Relations Act, and do a reduction in headcount. The one thing the practitioner can't do without court approval is remove one of the directors. The directors are obligated in terms of the Act to work with the practitioner, and it's very clear that they have this obligation and must provide him with all information and assistance. The practitioner can also use other consultants outside of his own domain. Although when I say domain, even though the practitioner might be coming on as part of a company, practitioners are appointed in their individual names and not in a company name. So the practitioner is taking the liability and the responsibility on their shoulders. And as I said, that's full fiduciary duties. The practitioner then has to put together a business rescue plan, normally, well, almost always, in conjunction with the board, the directors, the owners. We have this saying that, you know, the directors and owners know far more about the business than we do when we first get appointed. So we work together with management to put together a plan. It's fairly clearly laid out in Chapter 6 what has to go into the plan, but essentially a bit of the company's legal status, its history, what went wrong, who the directors are, importantly, who the creditors are, and then that plan, and also how long the practitioner believes it's going to take to get this company out of rescue. And then the plan is published. That's within 25 days of being appointed. Practitioner can apply for an extension to that. He needs 50% plus one of the creditors to agree by value. And he then has a meeting, we call it a Section 151 meeting, at which he explains the plan and then calls for a vote, calls for any suggested amendments to the plan. If he accepts the amendments, they need a 50% plus one to carry. And then they vote either on the original plan or the amended plan. And in order for the plan to pass, it needs 75% by value of creditors to say yes. Importantly, creditors. So this is a creditor-run process. They now have the say on what's going to happen. Obviously, they owe the money. So of that 75%, and importantly, it's of those creditors attending. And here's another take-home. If you decide not to get involved as a creditor in a business rescue, you've got a customer who's gone into rescue and you've been invited to this meeting, you decide not to turn up, you then have very few rights to complain. Well, in fact, you have none. Once the plan's adopted, you are carried along with whatever the terms and conditions of the plan are. Now, very often in a business rescue plan, creditors are asked to take what we colloquially call a haircut or a compromise. So you've been offered a percentage of what you're owed. So it's very important to involve yourself in the process and at least make sure that you exercise your vote. The voting can be done in person or by proxy. So if you're in a far-flung area of the country or in a foreign location, you can obviously appoint a proxy to attend the meeting on your behalf, often given to the chairman of the meeting. Once the plan is adopted, the practitioner then, it's almost the Bible of the company. He's obligated to implement the plan as stated. If there are minor amendments to the plan, because remember, this is business as usual, or trying to do business as usual. If there are minor amendments, he can do those without going back to the creditors. If he makes a major change, and major would be, we're going to trade this out and within 6 months we're going to pay everybody, and suddenly you decide that you're going to have to wind the company down, then that would require a creditor's vote again. Once again, 50% plus one. If the plan fails, it can fail in two ways. Either it doesn't get voted in. So the creditors vote, they turn it down, they have an opportunity to suggest amendments. If they don't suggest amendments, the practitioner then can suggest that he puts forward an alternative plan. If he remains silent, then any creditor can step forward with an alternative plan. And if neither party puts forward an alternative plan, then the plan has failed and the company should go into liquidation, will go into liquidation. The other way that it can not succeed is obviously what you thought was going to happen doesn't happen. You might have had a great way of rescuing a restaurant in January this year, and suddenly we're where we are now with the virus, and the whole thing collapses. So if at any point, another important point to take home, if at any point the practitioner believes that the company cannot be rescued, then he's obligated to put it into, apply to the courts to place it into liquidation. It is an important point. Once the plan is what the Act terms as substantially complete, and it's a useful word because substantially allows the practitioner to hand over the company back to the shareholders. It has to be solvent and it has to be broadly sustainable. You can't hand an insolvent company back to the shareholders because taking it out of rescue, you immediately get an application for liquidation. So no point in doing that. So he hands back a solvent company to the owners, and it doesn't have to be belt and braces. So you can leave some minor issues outstanding, which you leave in the hands of the directors or the shareholders. The important thing there is to make sure that the creditors' interests are protected. And that's it. It's the end of the plan. The other important thing to remember in a plan is if there's no funding available, it's almost impossible to rescue a company. I've certainly done one where I waited a year trying to sell off a major asset and got paid at the end of 12 months. So some practitioners are prepared to do that, but essentially the practitioner has to be paid as well as the other costs of the business, paying staff, paying rental, etc. In order to achieve that, we seek what we call post-commencement finance, or PCF. Another important point, if you are a shareholder owner of a business which is failing, and there's a lot of those at the moment, excuse me, and you decide to put some money into the company, but you're not 100% certain that it's going to pull through, and you are considering business rescue, then please put it into business rescue first. And the reason for that is, once you put your money in, and it's not in business rescue, if the company subsequently goes into rescue, you are just caught up in the with the body of creditors, and you'll get paid out in terms of the plan. However, if you put it in after rescue, you're immediately a preferred creditor, you've provided post-commencement finance, and the practitioner has to make sure that you're paid first before the creditors that were in existence on the day of rescue. Equally, you can ask the practitioner to provide you with security for your facility. And if you do that, then you become super preferred, and you're going to get paid out before anybody else, should the company not survive. Maurice, that's it. There's all the labor stuff and what have you, but I won't cover that now. That's a sort of overview.
Yes, yeah. Thanks for that, Peter. That was brilliant. I just want to remind the audience, this is a webinar. The idea is that you do ask questions. You can ask questions that are specific to your industry or specific to your company. If you want, we can schedule a private Zoom session with you and your team if you prefer to ask questions in that context. Bear in mind, it's pro bono. We are here to assist. So all you need to do is send us an email to info@cobra.org.za, and we'll gladly set up that Zoom session. It'll be with several experts, and if it's industry specific, we'll try and get some experts in that industry to also assist. All the partners are more than happy to attend to these consultations and to attend to all this work on a pro bono basis, subject to the means test, which is set out on our website. I just want to go back to a point you made, Peter. You made the point that the business rescue practitioners are obliged to put the business into liquidation in certain circumstances. Do you think that's what is happening now with SAA? Because there's a tension there now between the minister and SAA. But the business rescue practitioners, surely they can just rely on the fact that they have a statutory obligation to do what they're doing, whilst the minister is saying that there ought to have been consultation with the shareholders. Can you comment on that? Is that right?
Maurice, absolutely not. I mean, I stand in, well, not in awe, but I stand with sympathy for the practitioners of SAA. Les Mattison's a well-respected practitioner, and he knows the law backwards. He has an unenviable task on his hands, because not only is he dealing with a massive business that has been failing for some time, as we know, he's also now having to deal with the shareholder. But remember, the shareholder is also the major creditor, because the shareholder will have guaranteed all the banks that have provided facilities. So the pressure on Les is not as a result of it being an SOE, but rather because the government is the major creditor in the rescue. And I mean, we've had it a couple of times where you get a major creditor, they generally call the shots. Now, the practitioner, it's essential that the practitioner remains independent. And as I point out to major creditors fairly often, accept that they're a major creditor and may even have the casting vote. So they might have 75% of the vote and they are independent. Be that as it may, one's there to protect the entire body of creditors. And what fits one must fit all. But what does happen is your major creditor sometimes starts driving the process, and I suspect that's what is happening at SAA. Personally, I think the chances of SAA surviving in its current form are verging on zero. Not least of all, if we just look globally at what's happened. You've got Virgin in Australia going into administration, Mauritian Airlines, okay, a far smaller operation, going into administration. British Airways has just received, I think it was £200 million out of the UK government to support it. Virgin globally is looking challenged. So, SAA was already challenged, for goodness sake. So this crisis has just been, the straw that will break the camel's back. But as I say, I'm not enviable. I feel sorry for the practitioners because they have a torrid task at the moment. And, and on the other hand, you've got a major employer. And of course, that's a big focus for the government. I don't think it's all ego that they want their own national airline. Bearing in mind, British Airways is on a road to becoming a national airline again if they continue on the current route. Unlike, and Maurice, yes, I watched your interview last night, and well done on that, because you were on the button. Comair is a very, very different situation. Comair is a well-capitalized, well-financed business, well-run, and they just need breathing space, same, as many other businesses, because they're just not making sales at the moment. But I say to anybody that's considering rescue, if you're in an industry where you're taking deposits and pre-bookings, this applies to, hospitality industry, the travel industry generally, and most certainly the airlines. I certainly wouldn't be buying a ticket to fly to Cape Town in December this year off SAA, because I'm not too sure I'd be able to fly and get my money back. So, how can an airline survive when it's in this sort of situation where people aren't going to pay forward? Of course, within SAA, within the group, there's some very good businesses there. The maintenance business, I believe, is well run. So, there's assets there that will probably survive. And if it is an airline that's still in the national hands, it will be a far tailored down version of the existing SAA.
Thanks, Peter. I've put on the screen, you should have it there, just around SAA and the voting on the plan and the issues you've just addressed. If this was an example, and let's say this is SAA, so we have 100% shareholder who's owed on loan account R1 million. We have a trade creditor who's owed the creditors who owed 15,000, directors 500,000, and employees 100,000. Now, when it comes to the voting on the plan, and this is SAA, can you tell me what government could possibly do? What influence would government have on the plan?
Maurice, it's a very good question in respect of SAA, because what I don't, and I'm not privy to, is the government will be a creditor one removed, because the banks are the mainline creditors, but the governments are very guaranteed them. So if SAA were to go into liquidation, unfortunately, you and I are going to pay, because the man in the street, through his taxes, will have to pay to bail the banks out, because the government's committed and guaranteed, and the government certainly can't afford to default on its obligations. That would be a disaster. And that's a big number, I believe, a huge number, in fact. So I think that, in fairness to the government, they're also very anxious what happens there. Bearing in mind, just in square brackets, the government were fully aware of the rights and obligations of the business rescue practitioner, and they were also fully aware of their relationship vis-a-vis the practitioners. So it's not so they went into this blind. Obviously, they were under a fair amount of pressure, because Solidarity had already applied or indicated they were about to apply to the courts for a court-driven application for appointment of rescue practitioners. So in this particular example, because of the oddity of a 75% vote, of which 50% have got to be from the independent body of creditors. Independence, in the classic term, anybody that's had a relationship with the company or their immediate family has a relationship with the company is no longer considered independent. So a shareholder or a shareholder's spouse who's funded the company is not classed as independent. Now, what happens is your non-independent votes in a rescue plan are diluted by a third. So in this case, your shareholder, if this was SAA, has a significantly diluted vote, because your 15,000 creditors are the ones that you need 50% of them vote, of those voting. So if one creditor turns up and he's owed 1,000 rand in this example, you have to get the maximum you could get is a 2,000 rand vote for the plan, if that makes sense. So you'd have to go to your shareholder and say, we owe you 1 million, but please will you only exercise your vote over 1 million rand, because I have to have at least 50% of the total vote. So in this example, you've got the 1,000 rand creditor plus your shareholder both voting. So you've got 2,000 rands worth of votes, and 50% of them are independent, which is your trade creditor. So it's often a bit of a juggling act. If this example, I mean, you've used SAA. So in an SAA scenario, either the government is already a creditor, and as I say, I'm not privy to that detail. So they are, via the government structures, already direct lenders. That might be through the PIC, the IDC, whatever, into SAA, or they are guarantors of the banks, in which case the banks are at that meeting. Now, the banks would be classed as independent. So the government's exposure, as I said earlier, is indirect. If, however, it is a direct exposure, then that 1 million rand has very little say in this example. And what one would do in a case like that, if, for example, your 15,000 creditor is just being obstructive and decided, and you know that he's not going to vote, and that's an important point. As practitioners, we always do the behind-the-scenes lobbying to find out where creditors are, so to make sure that we get the vote. I mean, it's costly if your plan is turned down. It does happen. Studdefords is an example. The practitioner put up a plan and it was turned down a couple of times, and unfortunately, it finally went into liquidation. But you do that behind-the-scenes lobbying. You make sure the creditors are on board with you. But unfortunately, in life, you get those individuals who are just absolutely hell-bent on seeing the whole thing collapse, because they've got a grudge against the directors of the company very often, because they were promised certain things which haven't materialized. And in a case like that, in your example, Maurice, what I would do is go to the shareholder and say, I need 15,000 Rand PCF, I'm going to settle the creditor. I thereby settle that creditor of 15,000. The shareholders now put in 15,000 by way of PCF. or bought that creditor, so not PCF, sorry, he's bought that creditor, which you're allowed to do. And now I've got a 1,015,000 vote, which is going to be positive. In your example, the directors have a vote, and they're classed as non-independent, and same with the staff. Remember, employees are creditors every day that they work for you and haven't been paid. On the 25th of the month or the 31st of the month, you pay them, they're no longer creditors, and the very next day they become creditors again. And because of pension obligations and bonuses and etc., due to employees, they virtually are always creditors of the company. So they are an important group to consider in a rescue as well.
What vote do directors get on the plan? It's quite easy when it comes to percentages and working out pro rata what amounts are owed. So what is afforded to directors?
It's an interesting question, Maurice, and we cover this very often. And I say to directors virtually all the time in the SMME market, please consider what hat you're wearing, because a director he's a director, you've just told me. So in terms of the Companies Act, it's the official appointment. He could be a executive director in the listed environment, a non-exec versus exec. So he's executive director, he's therefore also an employee. So he's probably, well, as I said earlier, he will be a creditor because he's owed money as an employee. He could then well have provided funding himself to the company and become a creditor. But in the general scheme of things, a director falls into the same category as normal creditors, has the same vote as a creditor, but he's not independent. So that dependency means his vote is slightly diluted. The interesting take home here for medium-sized companies, and certainly in the listed environment, is that the shareholders have absolutely no say in the creation, the voting on of the business rescue plan, unless you've affected their rights. So you go to the shareholders and you say you're all ordinary shareholders, for example, and we acknowledge that, but in the rescue plan, I'm going to convert your shares to some sort of preference share or B share, or in other words, affect the rights of the shareholder. And if you do that, then you need the same percentage approval from shareholders on the plan, and these two different votes. There's a creditor vote goes through the creditors, we then refer to as a preliminary adopted plan, and then it goes to the shareholders for their vote as well. But under the normal course, the shareholders have no say. Just as an interesting take home here, if you're a smaller listed entity, and you need to have a majority of independent directors, so a classic structure, you've got a CEO and a CFO, both executives, and then you've got three independents. You have to have a minimum of three to meet the Companies Act requirements for the population of your audit committee. And you sit in at the board and you're wanting to take a vote, or you're having a discussion. I've got two of these exact live at the moment, where the board are currently discussing whether they're financially distressed. Why would the non-executive directors want to do anything other than put the company into business rescue? Because they're immediately protected, because the claim that they're trading recklessly disappears. So either in rescue, or as Marie said right at the beginning, in joining COBRA, or doing an informal compromise, which is not informal. It is a compromise, Section 155 of the Companies Act. You can do a compromise with creditors outside of rescue. But you're considering all of those, and the directors, non-execs, are pushing this thing into rescue, and you've got two executives believing that they know how to solve the problem and they can pull it out of the bottom of the bucket. Now, in that scenario, you might find that the executive directors suddenly find that they've got a rescue foist upon them by the non-executives. And rightly so. Who's going to, with the amount of obligations, remember the Companies Act doesn't differentiate between executive and non-executive. If you're a director, you're a director. Whether you're a full director or alternate director, you carry the same fiduciary duties. So those responsibilities sitting on a director under 75, 76 of the Companies Act are quite heinous. So you must make sure that you're protected. And if you're in that position, then surely I would want the company to go into rescue rather than trading, whilst I might get a challenge for trading recklessly.
Yeah, thanks for that. I just got one question for you. If a shareholder were to guarantee the payment of creditors, trade creditors, would that affect the shareholders' vote in any way?
If he's guaranteed, well, important point, and we always ask it, if, especially in the medium-sized business environment, very often the shareholders are the directors and have signed personal sureties to the bank. Those sureties still stand. Remember, the protection is for the company, not for the shareholder or the guarantor. So the guarantor is still obligated. It's important to check the terms and conditions of the guarantee, and we often face this conundrum. And we try and work, certainly if it's the executive that's under threat and a possibility of losing his personal residence, well, that's not a good person to be trying to work with to try and rescue a company. So we try and sort that out at the same time. But as practitioners, we're not obligated to do that. The bank has the right to go after the company and at the same time the individual. They don't have to separate. I mean, it's an intriguing thing, but it is the terminology in suretyships, because you would think normally your principal debt, if you cannot recover your principal debt, then you can go after your surety. And the principal debt is only sorted out once we've got an adopted plan and it's paid. So if you get a compromise and you only paid 40 cents in the rand, obviously the remaining 60 cents you can go after the guarantor. If you're sitting with a situation where a shareholder is prepared to guarantee the creditors pre or post-rescue, there's not much point in doing that. I'd rather use and if somebody's issuing a guarantee, it sounds as though the person's not a person of straw. So we imagine that they've got some finance available to them. It'd be far better to put that into the company as post-commencement finance, to use the money for the good things of rescuing the company rather than securing the creditors that are already in existence. However, there could be a situation where one creditor has been particularly difficult, and rather than buying out the creditor, the shareholder would prefer to guarantee them. It would be subject to negotiation with the creditor. Are they satisfied with the ability of the guarantor to pay? And if they are, then the creditor suddenly becomes quieter. Bear in mind, I mean, I often say this, it's a bit of an anomaly, but when you first go into rescue, things are always very noisy. Creditors are shocked. They can't believe that this thing's gone into rescue. And so you get a lot of noise from creditors. It quietens down as, importantly, trust develops between the practitioner and the creditors, who then realize that we're there to protect their interests and not against them. Very often the practitioner gets attacked because he's put in the same pot as the directors, and of course they all wanted their say against the directors who they feel have done them down. But yeah, Marisa, I wouldn't suggest the shareholder guaranteeing anything of pre-commencement liabilities. Obviously, if there's a personal guarantee, it could be from a family member and somebody decides to step in and replace that, that might make sense. But no, the creditors, certainly whether secured or unsecured, the security doesn't change, it's just frozen in rescue. So we don't affect security unless it's an unreasonable contract. You can go to court to have unreasonable contracts set aside. Often the case where you've got an owner sells his company on an MBO, classic, sells 60% of it, retains 40%, but still owns the company premises and enters into a lease agreement which is far above market rates. The practitioner can take that to court and have that lease set aside.
Yeah, thanks. I just want to comment on you mentioned business rescue shock, and creditors generally are shocked when a company goes into business rescue. But under the present climate, we're finding that the stigma associated with business rescue simply does not exist. The stigma that we've experienced as attorneys, as practitioners, the concerns, the counseling that used to be involved in relation to the stigma is no more. We're also finding within COBRA, the creditors are far more cooperative because they are subject to the same burdens as their debtors. I want to move on to just a labor aspect because it ties in with post-commencement finance, and it comes up often. The question is, what do we do about labor if we want to take our own money and pay salaries? And it's kind of tied in with the issue of a suretyship. If you have a suretyship, as Peter mentioned, and you are sued on the suretyship because the moratorium does not apply to the suretyship, it's best to rather lend the money as post-commencement finance to the company in business rescue. So that's when you put the company into business rescue, even when the creditor is not going after the company. And then you have the company settle the debt, because then you get the security afforded to you in terms of the Companies Act in relation to post-commencement finance. Now, when it comes to employees, well, let me actually start with contracts. Contracts are not automatically suspended in business rescue. So a lease agreement is not suspended, which means that if the business rescue practitioner does not send a notice in terms of the Companies Act suspending the contract, it remains in place. And that means that the landlord can still cancel the lease. So importantly, if a landlord is after you and is not cooperating, make sure that if you go into business rescue and you're outside of the COBRA environment, make sure the business rescue practitioner is aware of the provision where you can suspend agreements, because otherwise the landlord can come along and, even whilst you're in business rescue, evict you. So very, very important take home when it comes to PCF and sureties. Now, when it comes to staff, the same applies. If you're going to be lending money to the company to pay staff, rather put the company into business rescue then, because then you'll get the preference that Peter spoke of. So that's a good example of where business rescue is a very good idea outside of the context of needing the moratorium. If you don't need the moratorium, you still want to put into business rescue if you're going to lend money to your company. So, you know, on the question of employees and the suspension of contracts, those contracts do not get suspended. So the business rescue practitioner cannot suspend employment contracts. Employees are afforded the exact same rights as they enjoy prior to rescue. So Section 189 of the Labour Relations Act continues to apply. We've all heard about companies imposing remissions in salary. We've heard about the 25% and then the 50% and the 75%. You cannot simply do that with employees. You cannot simply impose unilateral variations to their employment contracts. The way to do it is to consult with the employees in terms of Section 189. Now, Section 189 deals with dismissals based on operational requirements. So it begs the question, if you don't want to dismiss your employees, you want to save their jobs, but you only want to negotiate a remission, why does the section dealing with retrenchments apply? It applies because if you get to a point where a variation is necessary, so a reduction in salary is necessary, and the employee refuses, you'll then at that point, on notice of the refusal, when told of the refusal, you're then obliged to dismiss and pay out a severance pay. So you cannot unilaterally, you need to get an agreement from your employees. Employees are agreeing at the moment. They understand that there has to be an urgent shift from fixed costs to variable costs. So we're not advising, the business rescue practitioners are not doing this, because if you simply reduce the salary by 25%, you're stuck again with a fixed cost. And the future is so opaque, you have no idea whether you can afford that. So what the business rescue practitioners are doing, the turnaround specialists, because most of the companies aren't going into business rescue, is they are negotiating salaries that are married to the company's cash flow. So if the company can afford to pay the full salaries, they pay the full salaries. If they can't, then all salaries are paid pro rata, the money that comes in. That's a good way of striking an equitable arrangement where everybody's jobs can be saved, where you deal with the opaqueness of the future. We don't know when COVID's going to go away. And employees generally are quite happy with that, because they see the company as a potential lifeboat. And it's similar to landlords when it comes to restaurants. They know that they've got to take a knock now if they want a tenant the moment COVID goes, a paying tenant the moment COVID goes. So that's a very, very important take home. You still need to consult with the employees. Now, COBRA does that, so we're happy to consult with your employees on your behalf. We've in fact done that. Not only that, in fact, I need to mention we've also had construction companies come to us and arrange special webinars for their suppliers, for the entire supply chain, because they wanted to assist their suppliers. We've been saying all along, Peter, that we're not about business rescue. Business rescue is a statutory relief that's available to businesses. There's other statutory relief outside of business rescue I'm going to ask that you take us through, and that's the provisions in relation to a compromise with creditors, Section 155 of the Companies Act. But before we get there, sorry, there is a question that I've been meaning to deal with, Peter, and maybe deal with this first. It deals with the SAA and the question of tickets and what is the position. The attendee writes, but then you wouldn't fly with any other airline as they may not survive at all, especially in Europe. Do you want to comment on that, Peter? Because that is a problem, and we've been dealing with travel agencies who don't know what to tell their clients, and in fact, we've given opinions on this very point. But do you have any comments before I dive in?
Maurice, yes, look, the important thing to consider here, and I'm old enough to remember the cause of the 2005-2007 crash. One of the major reasons there is that a company, AIG, American Insurance Group, who had backed all of these rather tricky loans that had been given to the sort of working classes of America by two institutions, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, rather, who generally were providing sort of low-income earners, blue-collar workers with mortgages guaranteed by AIG. And of course, there was systemic crash, and AIG eventually went into Chapter 11, I think it was. I can't remember the detail, but AIG collapsed, and that was one of the main triggers for why the entire financial markets globally crashed, because everybody had been buying this paper thinking it's guaranteed by AIG and we're going to get our money back. So you had the absurd situation that Northern Rock Building Society in the UK, which was a 200, 300-year-old building society providing housing loans to good people up in the Midlands and the north of the UK, was suddenly in administration because they were exposed to these American defaulters. Now, exactly the same can happen in the travel industry, because when you buy your ticket, you must make sure, first of all, if your travel agent can't prove to you, and it's certainly a take-home, that if you are buying a ticket, make sure that your travel agent is a member of IATA, and therefore you have some reassurance that there's insurance policy behind it should the travel agent default, that you can claim under the IATA insurance. It's going to take some time to get your money back, but you should get your money back. However, in a systemic situation such as COVID, and I'm not saying that this is the case, but you suddenly find a wealth of claims being lodged, certainly if SAA fails, or any of the big airlines fails, or for that matter, any of the big travel agency groups fail, then there's going to, there's a challenge to IATA whether they can actually pay out. So important point, make sure they are covered by IATA, so are airlines. But the issue there, and I mean, clearly we're going to continue flying. If I had a choice now, it's an interesting one. If I was flying to Cape Town, in the next, once airlines open up again, I would probably still choose to fly Comair down to Cape Town rather than SAA, because SAA is on a knife edge. Now, from our earlier discussion, I have no doubt, and I don't envy the government officials that are having to deal with this, are spending many hours trying to work out how to save this. For two very big drivers, they don't wish to have a call on them by the banks. I would not disagree, because certainly, as I said earlier, we're going to end up paying for that, firstly. And then secondly, there's a huge number of employees at SA, one of its problems, of course. So there has to be some realignment there, but still we're looking at losing thousands of jobs if SAA fails. But with that in mind, I still would be very cautious about who I fly with. And so you're still going to, and I mean, the question is specifically aimed at Europe. these good airlines and these bad airlines. We mustn't forget that something like Swiss Air failed and went into administration, and it was eventually closed down. Who would have thought that the Swiss airline would be the one to fail? So
look at what I'm looking at, Peter.
Oh, there you go. Yeah, well, there's synchronicity for you.
Yeah.
So just be cautious. Now, I don't expect people to sort of peek around the corner and be terrified to go outside of their house because these viruses out there that we can't see. But just be aware of it. And, and Maurice, picking up what you were saying earlier vis-a-vis the staff and suppliers, really do not, and it is unfortunately a malaise of a very large number of entrepreneurs. Very often when things don't necessarily go their way, it's a head in the sand story. And please don't do that. Rather just seek professional advice. Maurice has already talked about COBRA. Go into COBRA or wherever. Just go to your auditor, your lawyer, your accountant, whoever it is. It might even be your brother-in-law. And just get advice on what you should be doing, because the most critical thing in a turnaround, informal or formal, is communication. And if you're communicating with your staff and your suppliers, it's going to make your life a lot easier. It's sometimes hugely embarrassing because the ego takes a knock, because you don't really feel like telling people that you've been, had good business relationships with many years, to suddenly turn around and you can't pay. Maurice, you asked about 155. Sorry, that was a long story about flying. Section 155, very simply, very similar to business rescue, the main provisions. It's also part of Chapter 6, but the main provisions of Chapter 6 are all about protection. 155 doesn't give you protection. So anybody can still lodge an application to court for the liquidation of the company, so you don't have that protection. What you can do, though, and it's pertinent for companies where you have a small number of creditors and you believe that they are all open to negotiation, and you can go to those creditors and suggest a structure, the same sort of structure of the business rescue plan that's done in a normal business rescue. Put a structure together whereby if they're taking a compromise, well, they are taking it because you're going through the section which allows you to do it. The important thing here, though, is the body of creditors at large don't vote as one. You've got to get a vote from each class of creditors. So if you've got debenture holders, you've got to go to them. If you've got unsecured trade creditors, you've got to go to them. If you've got banks who are secured over the assets of the company, you've got to go to them. And each of those classes, you group them all into classes, and each class, you need 75% positive vote. And if you get a 75% in 2 or 3 or 4 of the groups, then you've got a compromise that will work. The important thing here is to get the affected parties to sign on the dotted line as quickly as possible, because people get cold feet and suddenly, rumors fly, especially in a place like South Africa. We're great rumor mongers, we are. And, suddenly people hear that things aren't that great and it might not work, and suddenly you've got a liquidation application. So when you're having those negotiations with the creditors, as soon as there's an agreement, as soon as that vote is taken, get the creditors to sign on it. They voted for it, therefore it is now sealed and delivered. And once you've got all those votes, you can then apply to court to make it an order of court, and you pay the creditors less than under whatever terms you're planning to. It's a nice provision, as in business rescue, that you have the flexibility. You owe people money. You have for example, you can go to them and rather than pay them cash, you can pay them by way of shares if the shares of the companies are worth anything, especially if it's a listed company. You will have to get the consent of the shareholders in that example, because the shareholders' rights then are affected. There might only be 100 of them, and now suddenly there's 3,000 of them. So their voting rights, if nothing else, and their share of the dividends is going to be far diminished. So you're going to need their approval. But generally, it's a business rescue. Not only is about the legal drivers that come through the act, but it's very much about how to be creative, how to come up with financial instruments, financial structuring that allows what appears on the face of it to be a lame duck, to create something out of it, to keep the creditors happy and get them to vote positively.
We have a question going back to the airlines, which is interesting. It says, I'm just curious to also find out how effective business rescue is when the institution that needs rescuing is influenced by the state and or politics, e.g. SAA, I would say it would be chances more effective of rescue because you have government with money who are prepared to put up guarantees because of the consequences. Wouldn't you say that if you have a big brother, such as government, your chances of rescue are greater?
Maurice, look, I mean, it's bearing in mind that the practitioner put forward a plan for PCF to government of 10 billion, and he was turned down. So he's had a very clear message from certainly Treasury that they're not going to fund the SAA. Now, that's an untenable situation, I believe, because, well, in fact, 10 billion, as we were told, would have been chewed up within about 3 months. And that's the sort of leakage that's happening at SAA. So it's a massive problem that they've got there. But by and large, generally, I would say yes, and not least of all because the alternative for government is too horrible to consider, i.e. they're going to have to pay out guarantees of many billions to the banks. So they would want it to survive. The interesting scenario that you're faced with in something that is government owned, first of all, it's in the public domain all the time. The next one would be a listed company that is obviously more or less in the public domain, but the shareholders are getting information directly. The rest are getting it via the media. And then to the the privately held company, which is merely in the domain of the creditors. So as soon as you've got a huge body of people who have the information, unfortunately, that equals a huge body of people that have a view. So there's going to be a lot of political lobbying. It would appear, and I say appear underlined because I'm not in government, so I wouldn't know, but it would appear that there is political uncertainty in government itself. So there isn't a consistent view coming out. You've got a minister of finance who, seems to be saying one thing, and then you've got a minister of labor and various others who are saying other things. And I mean, we've had that just recently with COVID, for goodness sake, where the president said, cigarettes will be up for sale, and the next day, Nkosazana Dlamini, Minister Nkosazana Dlamini said, no, that's not the case. So there is that uncertainty in government. And if you're a practitioner and you've got, in my case, it's always been shareholders, that you get disputes amongst the shareholders. It makes it very difficult. Of course, the way to do it is focus on the North Star and just realize what you're trying to achieve and not allow yourself to be swayed by, in normal situations, the shareholders, but in this situation, be swayed by the political noise in the media and directly. I mean, government officials would have clearly had many meetings with the practitioners and try and avoid that, as well as all the noise that goes with it, and try and focus on the issue at hand and concentrate on that and not allow the noise to divert you. Not easy though, definitely not easy. When you're getting press articles that say the practitioners don't know what they're doing, which is totally unfair. There's some good practitioners. Certainly Les Mattison has been around for ages. He was a solid insolvency practitioner, and he's a really good business rescue practitioner. He's got a number of large rescues under his belt. So, he's the right person for SAA, and I think Les is quite robust as well. So I take my hat off to him if he pulls it off, but it is difficult.
Peter, interesting question arises. Now, Les has been talking liquidation. We've heard that drum roll, that drum beat for several weeks now. But mindful of the fact, and I think this is another take home for the audience, a company in liquidation, the fees are set at either 3%, 6%, or 10%, depending on the class of assets that are sold. So it's a fixed rate that the liquidator gets. In business rescue, it's an hourly rate. So the question I have for you, Peter, is why are they talking liquidation when business rescue, and to the attendees, remember this, business rescue is about saving a business, or if you can achieve a better return for creditors than a winding up. So if you can't save the business, but you can sell the assets and it will achieve a better return, well, then business rescue remains appropriate. Why are they not talking about an orderly wind down, but rather liquidation in your mind?
Maurice, I suspect they're talking about both. it's the old story that if you're not going to pay me what you owe me, I'm going to threaten you with liquidation. So, you know, it is a tool available. Well, it's a threat, not a tool. It's a threat that the practitioner can level at anybody that's not committing. If you're not given post-commencement finance, which Les hasn't, so now he's got to go around and find money. Now, one of the interesting things with airlines, not only SIA, generally airlines don't own the aircraft because they all funded by the banks, global banks, and you know, if unpaid, it reverts bank, and in certain circumstances, probably reverts back to Boeing or Airbus, whoever is the supplier of the aircraft in the first place. So you don't have the luxury of selling off a whole lot of metal. And there will be a demand, not at the moment. There would be a very low demand for aircraft, obviously, but you know that demand will come back. And in a lot of situations, what remember, liquidators are not allowed to trade. They can sit on assets for a while, but they are obligated to sell as quickly as possible, turn the assets into cash, and pay themselves, firstly, as Maurice has just said, and then pay the remaining balance first to what we call in the waterfall, secured creditors, then preferred creditors, then the unsecured creditors. And as we know in South Africa, the unsecured creditors generally get nothing. So, because that's you're under forced sale. If you're putting something under the auctioneer's hammer, clearly the people are gathering to pick up bargains. So it's going to be a forced sale price. In rescue, you can do an organized wind down. What does that mean? It means that you're not forced. So you decide, you know, we've got 30 aircraft, we're going to, those that we own 100% and we don't have facilities, we're going to hang on to. But those that are bonded to the provider of finance, the banks, we'll sell those off and pay the banks out first. So you might take that as an attitude, so that you now handing back an airline that owns its own aircraft and thereby doesn't have this debt burden hanging around its neck. Now, if you do that, clearly you should get a better price for those aircraft. Not necessarily, but you should do. And we're talking aircraft, but remember, SIA has got thousands of different classes of assets, vehicles and equipment, etc., etc. There's also a number of businesses within the SIA group. There's the maintenance operation. There was SA Express, that's now has gone into liquidation, so that's no longer there. I'm not too sure where Mango fits into SIA, whether it's a separate company or whether it's just a division of SIA. But you know, you can sell off entire divisions. You can sell off part of entire divisions. So you could make a deal. There was talk about either Emirates or Virgin or Ethiopian Airlines showing an interest in SIA. You can bring them in as a majority shareholder, and they've got to put, obviously the terms of that is they put the cash in, which cash you would use then to settle the creditors on whatever compromise you've agreed to. So you can do all of those sort of things. But I don't know, Maurice, because I'm not privy to the information. I imagine, though, the pressure on the practitioners there to not compromise it, well, not necessarily not to compromise, but not cut staff. I think that's going to be a big burning issue at SIA. We've had a number of senior managers at SIA say one of the biggest problems is, and indeed, it's not just the people are pointing a finger at SIA. If you look at the global airline industry, SIA has got the highest headcount to miles flown. So, you know, just it's quite clear that it's overstaffed at the moment. Now, those people are all unionized. The unions have a say in the rescue, important point in SIA's case. So you've got to try and negotiate with government, the unions, the staff, different unions, the pilots and professionals in a different union from the blue-collar workers in SIA. So you've got a whole number of people that you've got to get to over the line, not all at the same time, but over a period of time. And if you've been told that you've got no money to do that, well, why not then just put it into liquidation? Because in a liquidation, obviously Les can sell off an asset and use the money from that asset to pay for the rescue. But you've got to make the assessment on the day. And remember, you've got to beat a liquidation valuation. So if he believes that, you know, selling off those assets immediately, the practitioners will take their 10, 3 or 1%, whatever the asset is, and he believes that that net amount will be now. Because remember, the other important thing in this is a take home. if you've been offered a compromise that's going to pay you out in a 12 months time, and you're going to get 100 Rand in 12 months time, that's only 90 Rand's value, because 100 Rand in 12 months time is only 90 Rand. Put 90 Rand in the bank today, it's worth 100 Rand in a year's time. So the time value of money, people very often forget about. A lot of practitioners forget about that as well. And it is an important point. If you're paying people out, make sure that the end figure makes sense from a liquidation point of view, because if you paid less now in liquidation, at least it's cash in hand. From 2 points of view, you've got the cash to invest, firstly, and then secondly, you're not taking a risk on this business, because remember, the payout is only subject to the rescue working. If it doesn't work, maybe it would have been better on day one. It's a very difficult decision often, but remember what the practitioner, a bit like the directors who are making decisions about whether they should or shouldn't go into rescue. Same thing for a practitioner. If he's deciding, should I continue or should this go into liquidation? The only time that's going to be challenged, if it goes to court or it eventually goes into liquidation. We have had a court case on this where the liquidator then summons the practitioner into a 417 inquiry and actually won his case, because the practitioner had been sitting on a CC for 3 years and doing very little, it appears. And in this case, she lost her case and had to pay the fees of the liquidator in the application. I'm not too sure what the other sanction was. So you do have that issue. You know, if you're sitting here today and I can sell off the whole of SAA for 100 Rand, whereas I think I might get 100 Rand over 3 years, then better to do 100 Rand now. So I suspect that's what the issue is there.
Thanks, Peter. Yeah, we're out of time, but I'll conclude by dealing with a question. So legally speaking, do we have measures in place to protect the practitioners from the political influence and public exposure that comes from rescuing these high-profile or government-influenced institutions? The relief or the steps that a business rescue practitioner can take is to, in my mind, resign. I don't think there's any protection in terms of the act that basically says if a shareholder pressurizes you, you somehow protected. You know, it's like directors. Directors have an independent duty to the company. They are not there to act at the behest of shareholders. And the same applies, because Section 75 and 76, which deals with fiduciary duties of directors, still applies. So I would say it's the business rescue practitioner is in the same position as a director. If a shareholder insists that the director act in a particular way, what does the director do? He cannot breach his fiduciary duty, so his only option is to resign or not act, and if he doesn't act, he gets fired. I'd say that the business rescue practitioner is in a very, very, very similar position. So that concludes today. COBRA is, as mentioned, it's about pro bono consultations, assistance. We can assist you in rescuing your company. The idea is that if you come into the COBRA environment and let's say you cannot rescue your company, the professionals are unable to, and the company goes into liquidation, you're going to have all of that at no cost, because the idea is even the application, the conversion of a business rescue into a liquidation, that generally costs between 30 to 50,000 rands, because it's because it's a high court application. So COBRA gives you that. You have the benefits of a knowledge base, and you also have the benefits of us being able to assist you with your employees in obtaining relief in terms of all the various relief funds. Yeah, so please, www.cobra.org.za. Think about why wouldn't you join. Thank you very much.